Welcome back to Men and the City. In today's video, we're going to talk about what's wrong with the economy. Now, this is the second installment in this series, so if you want to check out the first one, check out the link in the description below. In today's video, we're going to revisit this theme that I've been emphasizing on this channel since its inception, and that is that the economy is a human system. And as such, it comprises individuals, their livelihoods, their accumulation of wealth, or their suffering, their impoverishment, you might say, because there are real consequences for how economies are managed or mismanaged. And as I think most of you know, it's my view that the economy in the United States in particular, and the West in general, in the developing world, is completely out of whack. It's unsustainable, and it's beginning to cause severe social consequences for the vast majority of the population. And that's leading to an inflection point that I think we're beginning to feel as we speak. Well, how did we get here? How did this economic system, if you accept my premise, how did it become so out of whack? To begin this video, I want to read an excerpt given by an investor, a very prominent investor named Jeffrey Gundlach. He's known in some circles as the Bond King. He's a very smart man, and he's an investor that I have the utmost respect for because I think he tells the truth about what's really going on Wall Street and across the United States economically and beyond. And he gave a speech recently at the 40th anniversary grants conference about what is happening economically, what's wrong with the economy. And he's been raising alarm bells for a number of years about this predicament. And listen to what he had to say, and then we'll begin the video from there. You get a system that is set up where the means of production and the property relations, the ways in which the fruits of production are split up in the society, are in sync, and everybody is sort of happy. They buy into this deal of, okay, we're going to organize society this way. Here's the property relations, here's the means of production, and everything goes fine as time passes. Property relations very slow to change because the people that benefit from the property relations don't want them to change. So you get wealth inequality, and you get a tension between parts of society because the means of production change very rapidly. Think radio, television, internet, AI, They change very, very radically, and the property relations are calcified. And so things get terribly out of sync, and you need to reset the property relations, and you have to redo the institutions. Okay, so what exactly does Gundlach mean when he says property relations and means of production? Well, that's really what we're going to talk about today. Before we do, I want to emphasize the importance of something called the Cantillon effect. The Cantillon effect is, I think, a foundational pillar to understand what has gone wrong, especially since the United States left the gold standard in the early 1970s. What is the Cantillon effect? Well, effectively, it's the idea that the amount of money or the supply of money in an economy, it does not have a neutral effect on the means of production, on the productivity of that economy. In fact, it can be very disastrous. But importantly, that as the money supply grows, it will enrich certain industries and certain tiers of the economy, and it will impoverish others, especially if the financial system of that given economic structure grows and grows and grows. And needless to say, that is precisely what's happened in the United States. In fact, the way I have framed it is that the United States is a financial system with an economy. It is not an economy with a financial system. And that is at the root cause of the issues that we face today. Okay, so what effectively is the Cantillon effect? Well, here I'm going to read a quote from you that I think does a very good job of explaining exactly what we're dealing with. The Cantillon effect looks quite similar to a regressive tax. The first to benefit from, again, a growth in the supply of money are often corporations with plenty of investors, whether publicly traded or financed through private equity. Next, raw goods benefit from increased prices, including already heavily subsidized industries such as steel and aluminum. When they say subsidized, they mean government backed. Technology also benefits, for it is utilized as an intermediate good for many companies. Even within the raw goods and technology sectors, the quickest corporations to turn investments into production, in other words, to take that money supply and put it to work right away, large corporations like Amazon or Microsoft, which have the infrastructure to expand, benefit disproportionately. Okay, so those are the winners. What about the losers? Well, the losers tend to be, in my view, the most important industrial and manufacturing sectors, the ones that are responsible for the real economic growth that benefits everyone, whether they're the average guy on the street or they work on Wall Street. But the Cantillon effect inverts that process. In fact, it emaciates that manufacturing industrial output, and it impoverishes the average laborer, the average worker, because his wages are worth less and less and less as prices rise, which benefits those asset holders. So to a large extent, that has created this tremendous wealth inequality that we experience today. Okay, so if that's the case, how exactly did that unfold? Well, that brings us to globalization. Globalization was the process by which capital came into the United States in the form of stock investments, property investments, so forth and so on, which you would think would benefit American industry and production, but they haven't. And at the same time, American industry and production have either stagnated and declined, or they have been offshored. So in other words, to some degree, that industrial capacity has been dismantled because of the Cantillon effect and the globalization which activated it. So what has globalization really done? Well, here I'm quoting, or I'm going to give you some facts or some data points that comes from a foundationally important article written by Lynn Aleden called Capital Sponge. Listen to what she has to say here. U.S. stock market capitalization currently represents 61% of the global stock market, despite the fact that U.S. GDP is only 23% of global GDP. And we'll come back to GDP in just a minute. Public U.S. equities now represent about 200% of U.S. GDP. That's an astounding number. Listen to this part, because this part is particularly frightening. If the stock market falls by 1/4, it would evaporate an amount of net worth that is equal to about half of the country's GDP. Now, I know what many of you are thinking. Isn't it a good thing that capital goes into the stock market? Because at the end of the day, the stock market is a mechanism by which your money and mine can matriculate to certain industries so that they can be more productive. Well, that's the other part of the story here that is especially destructive and enabled by globalization. What we've experienced, as was well put in an article that I'll link below called Profits Without Prosperity, what's happened is that this capital that goes into the stock market never matriculates. It doesn't convert into productive capital expenditure. What it does is it goes back into the stock market. So again, the stock market grows and grows and grows, and the asset holders, the investors that own that stock, and remember, most Americans don't own any equity at all in any of these companies. They get richer and richer and richer, and on paper, these companies grow and grow and grow, but they're not actually hiring new staff. They're not building new plant and equipment. They're not expanding in such a way that benefits the real economy. Instead, it's just the financial economy. Again, this is the Cantillon effect that's been exaggerated, you might say, or amplified by globalization. So listen to this part here, because I think this does an excellent job of explaining where we are. 5 years after the official end of the Great Recession, corporate profits are high and the stock market is booming. Sounds familiar. Yet most Americans are not sharing in the recovery. While the top 0.1% of income recipients, which include most of the high-ranking corporate executives, reap almost all the income gains, good jobs keep disappearing and new employment opportunities tend to be insecure and underpaid. Corporate profitability is not translating into widespread economic prosperity. the allocation of corporate profits to stock buybacks deserves much of the blame. So again, these are companies that ostensibly have lots of stock valuation, but they're not putting that capital to work. They're just taking whatever profits they've got or whatever money is invested in them, and they're buying more of their own stock. Consider the 449 companies in the S&P 500 index that were publicly listed from 2003 through 2012. During that period, those companies used 54% of their earnings, a total of $2.5 trillion, to buy back their own stock, almost all through purchases on the open market. Now, he concludes by saying, why are such massive resources being devoted to stock purchases? Corporate executives give several reasons, which will be discussed later, but none of them has close to the explanatory power of this simple truth. Stock-based instruments make up the majority of their pay, and in the short term, buybacks drive up stock prices. All right, so the globalization that supposedly has benefited or enriched the United States hasn't actually done so. It's, you might say, diminished our economic prosperity in our industry. It's emaciated the productive capacity of capital in the United States, which just stays in the financial system and never trickles down to the rest of the population. Well, I know what you're going to ask next. What about tech? Because the technology sector, the QQQs, the more dynamic companies like Apple, aren't they worth the weight of this capital expenditure or this capital investment that goes their way? Well, in a paper that was released a few years ago, they make the case, and I think they're correct, that in tech, there's been the most egregious misallocation of capital. So in their piece called The Untrepreneurial Economy, listen to what they say. It is clear that entrepreneurship can be economically valuable, and that some element of entrepreneurial activity is immensely important to society. However, a profusion of Veblenian entrepreneurship can create a series of societal delusions about entrepreneurialism. With Veblenian entrepreneurship, a society can seem to be rife with initiative and growth-oriented entrepreneurs, while the quality of that entrepreneurship is actually low and unlikely to contribute to any widely shared policy goals. Moreover, significant government resources at both national and local levels may be put to poor use, funding the entrepreneurship industry and supporting startups as opposed to productive activity. Supporting startups directly is likely to have substantial deadweight and substitution effects. In other words, misallocation of capital. And listen to this last part. When governments contribute to hyping up entrepreneurship, a substantial portion of that investment will likely end up financing the expansion of the entrepreneurship industry and not high-quality ventures that it aims for that allocation of capital. Okay, so what does all of that mean? Well, what that suggests is that in the United States, there is this entrepreneurial industry, but that's not translating into dynamic innovation and startups that are actually scaling to benefit you and me. That's a major problem, and that's beginning to replicate, or it's beginning to manifest in the economy as interest rates rise. Because as interest rates rise and the cost of capital rises, a lot of these tech startup companies, they're going under. In fact, they're going out of business quickly because they don't generate any cash flow. To be more specific about it, what's happened over the last 20 years, because of this growth of the money supply, because of lower interest rates, because of globalization, is that there's this appearance of a startup industry. There's a pump and dump scheme, you might say. Lots of investors get preferred equity in startup companies that go public, and then as soon as they go public, they dump these companies. They dump the stock, and retail investors that don't know exactly the bottom line of these companies, they're not familiar with how productive they're going to be, they get washed. In other words, their investment dries up as the stock valuation plummets. That's not a dynamic or innovative economy either. Okay, so where's all of this headed? Well, there was an essay written several years ago that I'm going to link to below that asked a question. Has the United States reached the limits of its growth? In other words, going back to Gundlach, are the means of production themselves beginning to grind to a halt because of this property or concentration of asset holders that have grind down the system or have calcified the system in such a way that it's no longer flexible. To frame it differently, because capital goes into the financial system and it just stays there, and that is enriching a very small percentage of the population, and it's not matriculating down to businesses and industries that actually need it. Have we peaked in terms of our growth? And what does that peak even mean? Well, this is what the author of that piece had to say on the issue. Attention in the past decade has focused not on labor-saving innovation, but rather on a succession of entertainment and communication devices that do the same things as we could do before, but now in smaller and more convenient packages. Think of the latest iteration of the iPhone. Is the iPhone today innovative the way it was 10 or 15 years ago? No, it's not. Has it spawned a cottage industry of innovation, as was forecast 10 to 15 years ago? I would argue not, and that's what this author is saying. The iPod replaced the CD Walkman. The smartphone replaced the garden variety dumb cell phone with functions that in part replaced desktop and laptop computers, and the iPad provided further competition with traditional personal computers. These innovations were enthusiastically adopted, but they provided new opportunities for consumption on the job and in leisure hours rather than a continuation of the historical tradition of replacing human labor with machines. That's a pretty damning explanation. Moreover, when you consider the industrial revolutions of the past or the different iterations of them, and in this essay, the author claims that there are basically three iterations or three expressions of industrial revolution. Industrial Revolution 1 was the steam engine. It was railroads. It was the cotton gin. Industrial Revolution 2, electricity, the internal combustion engine, running water, indoor toilets, chemicals, petroleum, entertainment, communication, the telegraph, etc., etc., etc. What has the information age brought us? Computers, the internet, and mobile phones. Now, those things have been innovative, but have they been as innovative as those previous industrial revolutions? I don't believe they have. And if you look at some of the charts that I'm showing on the screen now, you can see that the productivity per capita has fallen. And in fact, today we're in a period of what many call the great stagnation. In other words, again, the money supply has grown. The financial system has exploded in size, but productivity isn't manifesting. It's not growing in proportion to these other relationships, to these other financial relationships that have simply calcified and now dominate our entire economic structure. All right, so if you're with me so far, we've reached a point in which the financial system and its growth is so overwhelming in size that it's beginning to eat away at the underlying economy all around it. And that leads us to the end of Gundlach's statement, a reset. A reset means that the means of production themselves need to experience a kind of creative destruction, a rebalancing so that we can get back to growth. At the same time, because you have these calcified or concentrations of financial capital, that financial capital is going to revolt. It's going to obstruct any ability for the means of production to grow. So the way forward requires a financial crisis. It requires a leveling effect in which that financial system contracts and contracts substantially such that it shrinks the financial system back down to being just a part of the economy and not the reverse. How will that process unfold? Is that transition underway? Well, those are subjects that I will cover in the next installment. So hopefully today's video was cause for concern, but also gave you some sense of where we're headed and why the economy doesn't function the way that it once did, why we're not as productive as we should be. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.